Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike King. I own and operate an insurance brokerage called Intercity Insurance Services, and we are the official insurance provider to the Canadian Quilters Association and their member guilds. And we are pleased to be presenting today an overview of the insurance program that we provide to the guilds, members of the CQA. And the purpose in this is to give a little bit more information that might be found on paper and to perhaps answer some questions that may be festering out there, or perhaps to cause some conversation and indeed other questions that we will be happy to answer if you'd like to contact us in the future. There are three insurance components that are part of this insurance program, and I'll speak to each of them individually. And without further ado, we'll get going here. So assuming we can get the things to go, there we are. So the very first component in the insurance program is probably the most important, or indeed the one that gets the most discussion. Specifically, this is a commercial general liability insurance policy that covers the guild itself, the board, the volunteers, others who may be acting in an official capacity on behalf of the guild, all for bodily injury or property damage claims that might be brought against them by a third party. Best example, and you'll see this on a slide in a few moments, but slip and fall. You decide to hold an event, a class, what have we, you invite people to a school that you are occupying for the purposes of offering that service, or someone slips and falls, they decide to sue because you were in control of the space at the time of their injury. It's the commercial general liability policy that would respond and defend you and pay out on your behalf up to the limit as shown, in this case $2 million of coverage, plus defense fees. And you should know with this policy, as with all liability policies, the policy contract frankly requires the insurer to respond whether you are guilty or not. So it's important to know that. In addition to the bodily injury and property damage coverage that's provided under the commercial general liability policy, there is personal injury or advertising injury with a similar limit of $2 million. You advertise something incorrectly, you misspell a name by chance or some other thing that's not bodily injury, then indeed you are covered for those things. The next coverage described here, and this is just a summary, folks, just so you know, there's a little bit more to it. These are the highlights, as it were. There's something called tenant's legal liability, any one premises of $500,000, and what this is intended to provide coverage for is your specific occupancy of a tenanted space you don't own. If there were some incident that caused damage to that space, and the owner of the building decided to sue the guild for liability for damage to their building, there's $500,000 of coverage specifically allocated to respond to that claim that speaks, frankly, to the value of the building. So I don't know, a small fire ensues because a sewing machine decided to blow up. Obviously, I'm being facetious, but I hope you'll get the point. And some minor damage occurs to the space that you're occupying. The landlord's insurer compensates the owner of the building for that damage under their property insurance policy, and then they decide to subrogate or sue the guild because in the end they are responsible for that damage. It is the tenant's legal liability coverage that would respond. There are some leases that some guilds have entered into where the tenant's legal liability limit is more than $500,000. If that is the case with your guild and you need to have that limit increased, it can be. In all of our experience with CQA, it has happened once thus far. $500,000 is a very common limit as required in a lease, if there's any reference to it at all. Coverage territory in this policy is Canada only, meaning to say that any guild who is operating within the boundaries of Canada is covered, regardless of where it may be. It's not restricted to any one premises within Canada. It's indeed Canada-wide. For those guilds that are relatively close to the American border, if you were to host an event in upstate New York or upstate Washington State or some other place like that in the United States, we would need to know to make sure that your coverage extended to cover your activities outside of Canada. But failing that, it is an automatic cover anywhere in Canada. There is a contingency within this policy for voluntary medical payments. And we see this on every commercial liability policy with varying limits. And what this is intended to do, folks, is to allow the insuring company, not you, but the insuring company, to respond to an allegation that may have been brought against the Guild for a minor medical expense that a third party suffered as a result of some activity that you hosted. I'll give you an example, and I go back to this call. People assume that when lawsuits ensue that it's always a very serious event. It isn't always a serious event. Sometimes it's rather minor. So again, I slip and fall in your Guild space on a wet floor. And as a result of my injuries, I have to rent a wheelchair to mend my broken leg, or crutches, or some other thing, or I get physiotherapy that's not covered by my provincial health care. And all of a sudden, I've accumulated bills of medical expense, out-of-pocket expense, for $3,000 or something. And darn it, I'm not going to pay for that. I feel that the Guild is responsible. They should have mopped up the floor. And I decide to assert that they are liable for my out-of-pocket expense. You can see here that the insurance policy has a contingency for up to $5,000 for such an event. And at the insuring company's sole discretion, rather than defend and say, yes, well, you'll have to sue us in order to get any compensation, the insurance company decides quite arbitrarily to write a check to me for $3,000 to make it go away. It's smart business. It's built into the policy. Frankly, you as the insured don't really have a lot of control over whether the insurer does or doesn't make that payment. But I've certainly seen it in my career where the insurance companies will exercise that in an effort to avoid a long, protracted medical claim. Final point on the screen, additional insureds. We often are asked by guilds to add landlords of rented space as additional insureds to the Guild policy. It can be done. We are happy to do so. However, when we are asked to do so, it is a requirement that we have a chance to review the occupancy agreement that led to the request. In other words, it's fine to say that you're going to hold your show at rented space at the YMCA, for example. And the YMCA says, okay, you're welcome to have your show here in this rented space. However, we want to see a certificate of insurance. In addition to proving that you have insurance as the tenant, we want our name on it. Well, frankly, that's not really good enough. We'd really like to know what it is that's motivating them to have you add them to your policy, because you are, after all, extending your coverage to embrace their liability, even though you don't own the space. I repeat, we can do this. We are willing to do so, but we'd like to have a copy of when our occupancy agreement exists for your activity, so that we can be sure that all the clauses within your occupancy agreement are met, and that we're not overextending policies where we don't need to. That's not in anyone's best interest. So we just want to make sure it's done properly. So here are some examples again. The bodily injury and property damage claims, which I didn't speak to. So again, these are the coverages that are provided under the commercial general liability policy. And there are really no restrictions on this policy, with a few exceptions, one of which is noted here with the service of alcohol. If the Guild itself obtains the liquor permit from their provincial control board for the purposes of having a cash bar at an event, or a fundraiser, or some other thing, then we need to be advised, because frankly there is no coverage for claims arising from the service of alcohol unless we have a chance to again endorse the policy, or frankly what we would do is get special event policy coverage for that specific days when the alcohol might be served. Now that's very different from the Guild deciding to have their Christmas party at a public space where there is a bar service being provided by the venue. In those circumstances, we do not need to be notified, because frankly the liability arising from the service of alcohol falls entirely back upon the venue. It's they that would have the servers and people responsible for that service, and it's not a concern to the guild. So it's really only when you're actually selling alcohol that we need to be advised. So that's now the other policy that is talked about frequently is directors and officers liability insurance. This is separate coverage to the commercial and commercial general liability policy. This policy does, the directors and officers liability policy does not cover bodily injury or property damage claims. Directors, officers, and others on the board are covered for bodily injury and property damage claims under the commercial liability policy. But this policy, which we choose to call management liability just for clarity's sake, speaks to the administrative responsibilities that specific individuals on the board are tasked with. So the treasurer, for instance, who's responsible for all the pennies, how they're for tax filings and what have we, and others on the board who have official duties. This policy is intended to protect them for those official duties, for things that we define, frankly, in the insurance world as wrongful acts. So not bodily injury or property damage, but wrongful acts. The example I use frequently is fundraisers. A guild might have a fundraiser with an express purpose or a specific purpose in mind. You sell raffle tickets to buy new equipment. And after the funds have been gathered, rather than buying new equipment, you decide as a board or as an individual on the board to take a trip to Mexico or have a meeting somewhere else, or you decide to repurpose that fund in some other way than was originally advertised. A member of the general public could actually hold you accountable for that wrongful act. That's the misappropriation of funds. One board member could sue another board member for their wrongful act. So this is very important coverage. All not-for-profit societies are required to have it in law, but I can tell you, given that we insure quite literally thousands of not-for-profit associations, both big and small across Canada, under the New Societies Act, which is in every province and territory in the land, it is critically important to have this coverage. Very inexpensive coverage, but does provide protection to what are typically volunteer board members for their activities. So it's rather important. So here are some questions and answers that I won't repeat, but you can certainly go through on your own on this slide at a later date. There's a definition of what a wrongful act is. There are some nuanced differences defined here between the commercial general liability policy and the directors and officers policy, and I think it should be self-explanatory. But think about the directors and officers coverage as management. Think about the commercial general liability as being property damage and bodily injury claims, and then it should become more clear. So the third and final component in our program is property insurance. And last year we made available to the CQA and those guilds that wanted to participate, it's not mandatory, a property insurance policy wherein they could obtain up to $10,000 of contents coverage for equipment and other things that an individual guild might own. We don't really care where the property is stored, but we need to know where that is just for our files. We want to know what the property is comprised of in general terms, and we have a reasonable idea of what the guilds typically have. This policy would respond, excuse me, not only at your usual place of activity, but also away from that space. It covers it well in transit to and from your typical space. It would cover it at a trade event, for instance. But what I want to be clear here is that this policy, this $10,000, is intended to provide coverage for guild-owned property. This is not property insurance for all of your members. Notwithstanding what I've just said, there is contingency within this policy for the care, custody, and control of the guild, or rather care, custody, and control of non-owned property. And here's an example. Here are two very specific examples, actually, that might help to clarify this. Works in progress that are left at the class space that are owned by individual members. We encourage members to insure their own stuff. I don't know how else to really say that, except to say that really we all have an obligation to take care of our own assets. It is not the guild's responsibility to insure member-owned property. Now, having said that, where there is property that is in the care, custody, and control of the guild, if there were a loss, and if the member, in this case, felt that the guild had some responsibility for the loss of that property. I don't know, last guy out of the classroom just didn't lock the door. They woefully neglected to take care of that property that was owned by the members, and a bunch of things were stolen. Or at a trade event, there are a number of quilts on display, and security is lax, and a number of quilts that are owned by individuals are stolen from the guild's trade space. There is coverage for that. But someone's going to have to make an allegation and show that the guild itself is responsible for that. But that's very different from an individual who creates a quilt that may have some very significant value. We expect, and you should expect as the guild, that that member will insure their own property, their own stuff. Because really it's up to them to decide values. It's up to them to decide how it's going to be secured. It's up to their insurer how they wish to protect the individual member who owns the asset. So it's really a personal issue, but there is contingency within this property policy that's issued in the name of the guild for that care, custody, and control of the non-owned property. And frankly, it comes up all the time in the exhibition forum, where we've got a number of members who may have quilts on display at a trade event that is really being controlled by the guild itself. It's not really the members' show, it's the guild's show. And in those circumstances, then we can certainly help to protect. But in any event. So last but not least, we've already addressed some of these things. Adding landlords or venues as additional insureds. Yes, we can accommodate it. We do need to have a look at the space agreement so that we can make sure that all the requirements are being met. Does it cover quilts owned by a member? As I've just described, yes and no, which I know is an ambiguous answer, folks, and I don't mean for it to be confusing. But fundamentally, the guild members should be insuring their own property, and but that we recognize that there will be some circumstances where the guild truly is in control of the property, and in those circumstances will protect the member. We've talked about claims that might be covered under the D&O policy or the management policy, and can the guild obtain more than $10,000 in property insurance under this program? The answer is yes, but they have to make separate application to us directly. I can tell you of the 140 or so that are participating in the property component on this program, I think we've had 2 or 3 requests in the past year where guilds have significant assets or assets exceed 10,000. And in those circumstances, we issue a separate policy and for the guild's purpose. It's very inexpensive, I don't mind saying, but for most of the guilds, it seems that 10,000 is more than adequate. So, without sounding too abrupt, that is the end of our webinar today. We've addressed the commercial general liability policy, the directors and officers or management liability policy, a property insurance policy. We've talked about the things that we can do, the things that we're willing to do. And again, if any of you have questions arising from this presentation, you're certainly welcome to contact us. You'll see at the bottom left of this screen, there is an email address, info@intercityinsurance.com, where my colleagues and I will be happy to answer your inquiry. We can also be reached toll-free at the phone number on the screen. And I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. And if we can be of service, I hope you'll let us know. Bye now.